July 30, 1945. The Philippine Sea.
12:14 a.m.
The first torpedo struck the USS Indianapolis on her starboard bow and detonated in the forward fuel tanks, sending a column of fire 200 feet into the air that was visible for miles in every direction across the dark Pacific. The second torpedo struck 12 seconds later, hitting the engine room and breaking the ship's keel. Captain Charles McVay III was thrown from his bunk by the first explosion and was on the bridge within seconds. What he saw told him everything he needed to know in the first moments. The bow was already gone. The ship was listing rapidly to starboard. The lights were out throughout the ship. The engines had stopped. He gave the order to abandon ship at 12:17 a.m., 3 minutes after the first torpedo hit. 12 minutes after the first explosion, the USS Indianapolis was gone. She had gone down so fast that the standard emergency procedures, the orderly abandonment of ship with life rafts and life jackets and distress signals and the activation of the automatic position transmitters, could not be fully executed. Men who had been sleeping were in the water before they had fully understood what had happened. Life rafts that should have been distributed were still lashed to the deck as the ship went under. The distress signals that were transmitted were received by at least 3 stations whose operators, for reasons that would be investigated and debated for decades, did not act on them. Approximately 900 men went into the water when the Indianapolis sank. The water temperature was approximately 85 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough to prevent hypothermia, and it would prove to be the least of their problems. Nobody knew they were there. The Indianapolis had been sailing from Guam to Leyte Gulf in the Philippines, completing a classified mission whose nature her crew did not know but whose importance they had understood from the urgency with which she had been loaded and dispatched. The mission had been the delivery of the components for Little Boy, the atomic bomb that would be dropped on Hiroshima 9 days after the Indianapolis was sunk. The uranium components and the bomb assembly equipment were already at Tinian Island. The Indianapolis had completed her mission. She was sailing to Leyte Gulf for training exercises when the Japanese submarine I-58, commanded by Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, found her at midnight on July 30th and fired 6 torpedoes. 2 hit. 12 minutes later, Captain McVay and approximately 900 survivors of his crew of 1,196 were in the Philippine Sea with whatever they had managed to grab in the chaos of abandonment. The rescue that should have come immediately did not come for 4 days. The failure to notice that the Indianapolis had not arrived at Leyte Gulf was the result of a series of administrative failures that would result in courts-martial and official inquiries and would be debated by naval historians for decades. The ship had not been required to report her arrival. The Leyte Gulf Command did not consider it unusual when a vessel did not appear on schedule. The distress signals that had been transmitted were not acted upon. The report that the Indianapolis was overdue was filed but not treated as an emergency. For 4 days, 900 American sailors were in the open Pacific with no rescue coming. The first day in the water was a test of physical endurance and organization. The survivors were scattered across several miles of ocean, some in life jacket groups, some in the few rafts that had been deployed, all trying to account for their shipmates and assess their situation and maintain the discipline and the hope that the situation required. Officers organized their groups. Petty officers took charge where officers were absent. Men who had been on watch and were fully alert helped men who had been sleeping and were still confused from the shock of the sinking. The fuel oil that had been released when the forward tanks exploded covered the water across a wide area and coated the men in a thick black film that burned their eyes and made drinking the seawater that sloshed into their mouths more than usually dangerous. The oil would prove to be a mixed curse, its coating on some men's skin reducing the rate at which the sun burned them during the days of exposure that were coming. The sharks came on the first night. The Pacific Ocean in the Philippine Sea is not empty water. It is full of life, including the oceanic white-tip sharks that patrol the deep water far from land and that are among the most aggressive and least discriminating of the shark species. The blood and the oil and the sounds of 900 men struggling in the water attracted them quickly, and the attacks that began on the first night would continue for 4 days. The shark attacks have become the defining image of the Indianapolis disaster in the decades since, and the reality was as bad as the image suggests. Survivors described being surrounded by fins that circled continuously, fins that would disappear and then reappear from a different direction, and the moments of impact when a man would scream and then go silent and then the water around the group would turn dark. The attacks came more frequently during the hours of low light, dawn, and dusk, when the sharks appeared to be most active, and they came at night when the men could hear but not see what was happening around them. The psychological effect of days of shark attacks on men who were already exhausted and dehydrated and burned by the sun was one of the most systematically destructive aspects of the Indianapolis ordeal. Men who maintained their composure during the physical attacks were affected by the sounds and the visual evidence of what was happening to others. Men who had been rational and organized in the first hours began to deteriorate as the days passed without rescue, as the sharks continued, as the thirst that seawater cannot quench became consuming. Hallucinations began on the second day for many of the men. Dehydration produces hallucinations that the victim cannot always distinguish from reality, and the hallucinations that the Indianapolis survivors experienced were often indistinguishable in their vividness from genuine perception. Men saw islands that were not there and swam toward them and drowned. Men saw ships and swam toward them and found open ocean. Men experienced elaborate delusions that they were on shore, that they had been rescued, that the ordeal was over, and then the moment of return to reality was worse than the original suffering because it had to be endured twice. Gunner's mate First Class Cecil Ford organized a group of approximately 30 men in his section of the survivor field and maintained discipline and organization throughout the 4 days in a way that directly saved lives. Ford kept his group together when the tendency toward individual wandering that dehydration and hallucination produced would have scattered them. He allocated the limited fresh water from the few life raft containers that had made it into the water. He kept men from drinking the seawater that would accelerate their deterioration. He maintained the watches that allowed the group to look out for shark attacks and help each other when the attacks came. Ford's leadership was representative of what kept more survivors alive than the conditions warranted. The organizational structures that the Navy had created, the chain of command and the discipline and the knowledge of survival procedures that every sailor received, held together in some groups throughout the ordeal in ways that are remarkable given what those groups experienced. In other groups, the organizational structure broke down entirely as the days passed and the conditions worsened. Men who had been reliable and disciplined began acting on their hallucinations. Men who had refused to drink seawater in the first days gave in on the third and fourth days when the thirst became literally unbearable, and the seawater they drank accelerated their deterioration and their deaths. The difference between groups that maintained discipline and groups that did not was ultimately the difference between the men who survived and the men who did not. On the morning of August 2nd, 1945, the fourth day after the sinking, a Navy PV-1 Ventura patrol aircraft on a routine anti-submarine patrol flew over the survivor field. The pilot, Lieutenant Wilbur Gwynn, was not searching for survivors. He happened to look down at the right moment and saw something in the water that was not consistent with the normal appearance of the ocean. He circled lower. He counted heads. He sent the emergency message that had not been sent 4 days earlier when it should have been. The rescue that followed was itself a story of remarkable courage. Lieutenant Adrian Marks, flying a PBY Catalina in response to Gwynn's report, arrived over the survivor field and made a decision that naval regulations technically prohibited. He landed his aircraft on the open ocean in the daylight, in conditions that made the landing dangerous and the subsequent takeoff from open water impossible without calm conditions that did not exist, because there were men in the water who were dying and there was a single aircraft that could reach them before the surface ships arrived. Marks landed. He began pulling men out of the water and into the aircraft. He pulled so many men out that he eventually had to lash men to the wings of the Catalina because the interior was full, the aircraft riding lower in the water with each additional survivor, until she could no longer taxi safely and had to wait for the surface ships to arrive and transfer the survivors. The destroyer Cecil J. Dobbins arrived first among the surface ships and began recovering survivors. The cruiser Indianapolis had taken 317 men home from the latter Gulf 4 days of rescue operations. Of the approximately 900 men who had entered the water, 317 were still alive when the rescue was complete. The 583 who died in the water over 4 days had died of the shark attacks, of drowning, of dehydration, of the hallucinations that caused them to wander away from their groups, of the cumulative physical deterioration that 4 days in the open ocean without fresh water produces in the human body. The mission that the Indianapolis had completed before she was sunk was itself a story that the survivors did not learn until after the war. The components she had delivered to Tinian were used in the bomb dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. The bomb that ended the war had been carried to the Pacific by a ship whose crew was dying in the Philippine Sea while the bomb was being assembled and prepared for delivery. The Indianapolis survivors who lived to hear this information had complicated reactions to it. Some found in it a kind of meaning, a connection between their ordeal and the end of the war that gave their suffering a context it had previously lacked. Others found the connection accidental and irrelevant, unable to reconcile the nobility of the mission with the abandonment that followed it. They had delivered the weapon that ended the war and had then been left in the ocean for 4 days while their shipmates died around them. Captain McVay was court-martialed for hazarding his ship by failing to zigzag, a charge that several Japanese naval officers, including Commander Hashimoto who had sunk the Indianapolis, testified was unjust. Hashimoto testified that zigzagging would not have prevented him from hitting the ship. The court-martial was widely viewed as an attempt by the Navy to deflect blame from the administrative failures that had allowed 900 men to go unrescued for 4 days onto the captain who had been in the water with them. McVay was convicted, though the conviction was later remitted. He received hate mail from the families of men who had died aboard his ship for the rest of his life. He killed himself in 1968, holding a toy sailor in his hand. The survivors of the Indianapolis fought for decades for McVay's exoneration. They succeeded in 2000, when Congress passed a resolution that found McVay's record should reflect that he was exonerated for the loss of the Indianapolis. The resolution came 32 years after McVay's death. The survivors of the Indianapolis formed one of the tightest communities of any American military unit from a Second World War, bound together by what they had experienced in a way that 4 days in the open Pacific with sharks had created. They held annual reunions for decades, the numbers dwindling each year as the men who had been in the water aged and died, until the last reunion was held in 2017 with only a handful of survivors still living. Edgar Harrell, who survived 4 days in the water and lived to the age of 94, was asked in an interview near the end of his life what he wanted people to understand about the Indianapolis. "I want them to understand that we did not give up," Harrell said. "Not one of us gave up. The ones who died kept fighting until they couldn't fight anymore. The ones who lived kept fighting until the rescue came. We were American sailors and we did not give up. That is what I want people to understand." The rescue that eventually came on August 2nd, 1945 found 317 men still alive in water that should have killed all of them. They were alive because American sailors do not give up. They were alive because men like Cecil kept their groups together and their discipline intact through 4 days of conditions that should have made discipline impossible. They were alive because they were Americans and they refused to stop fighting even when fighting meant simply staying in the water 1 more hour, 1 more day, until someone found them. Someone found them. In the end, someone always finds them. That is what America does. It finds its own. It came 4 days late for the Indianapolis, and that lateness cost 583 lives that should not have been lost, and the men who should have prevented that lateness were held accountable in ways that were both insufficient and in some cases unjust. But on August 2nd, 1945, when Lieutenant Marks landed his Catalina on the open Pacific because there were Americans in the water and he was the aircraft that could reach them, America found its own. 317 men came home. They had been in the water for 4 days. They had survived sharks and dehydration and hallucinations and the accumulated weight of watching their shipmates die. They had survived because they refused to stop fighting, because American sailors do not give up, because the will to live is strongest in the men who have trained the hardest and endured the most and understand what they are fighting for. The Indianapolis delivered the weapon that ended the war. Her crew paid for that delivery in a way that no crew should ever have to pay. And in the end, 317 of them came home to tell the story that the 583 who died could not tell. They told it for the rest of their lives. They told it so that the 583 would be remembered. They told it so that what happened would not be forgotten and would not happen again. They told it because American sailors do not give up, not in the water, and not afterward. That is the Indianapolis. That is what her crew was. That is what they are still, in the memory of a nation that should never forget what 900 men endured in the Philippine Sea for 4 days in the summer of 1945. They did not give up.